Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Members Question and Answer. Today we're answering comments from our channel members on frontline episodes and other videos about the war in Ukraine and its impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and now global commentator on all matters conflict and security. So the first question we're going to take today is from Joshua, and he turns around and says that John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, has repeatedly stated that Trump tried to withdraw from NATO in his first term, but he was talked out of it by other people around him. So he's concerned that right now he does not have the same people around him to talk him out of it, and asks, could Trump's new cabinet team make him pull out of NATO? Well, that's interesting. Trump's new cabinet team, those that have got direct influence on this, in reality, there are four of them. There's Marco Rubio, who is the new Secretary of State. He's fairly experienced and has got some strong views. There's Mike Waltz, his new National Security Advisor, who again has got an element of experience, but is ex-military. His experience at this sort of level is not as much as you would expect. And then we get into Tulsi Gabbard. She is the Director of National Intelligence. She's got no intelligence background whatsoever and will be in a massive learning curve. And the most recent appointment is Pete Hegseth, who former National Guard and then Fox News presenter, is the Secretary of State for Defense. There's a big difference between being in operations as National Guard or on the front line in the military and working at this geopolitical level, this military strategic level in Department of Defense. I'm wondering if Gabbard and Hegseth are appointees because that makes it easy for Elon Musk with his efficiency drive to get in and deal with some of the bigger agencies and the bigger costs there are to the US government, rather than looking at what's going on outside. However, going to the particular question and NATO, there was no doubt that Trump was putting a lot of pressure on NATO and NATO membership. But we have to remember he approaches things from a businessman's perspective. And from a businessman's perspective, he was seeing that a large proportion of NATO members were asking the US to come to NATO's defense should Russia attack. But they weren't willing to pay the 2% of GDP that they had signed up to whenever they had applied to join NATO and come into NATO, and hadn't done for many years. So in effect, they were expecting their defense to freeload off US capability. And Trump as a businessman came in and went, no, stop doing it. If you don't pay, I don't play. Now, that was interpreted as undermining Article 5 of NATO's constitution, which is an attack on one is an attack on all, and created a lot of internal debate within NATO. The result of that internal debate meant that some of the larger countries that were not meeting the 2% GDP target actually changed their budgets and are now meeting the 2% GDP target. So that allowed Trump to ramp back a bit. Whether that ramping back was him ramping back or pressure from his people around him at that time, it's difficult to work out. There are still NATO nations who are not contributing 2% of their GDP to their defence and meeting their NATO commitments, including Canada. And this is where I think what we'll see when Trump comes in is increased pressure on Canada and European nations to make sure that they're not just hitting 2%. It wouldn't surprise me if he tries to push 2.5% or 3% of GDP as the new NATO norm. Because what he wants to do, I believe, is make sure that the European NATO nations are in a position to look after, in a much better way, what is going on between Russia and Ukraine as a European conflict. Because the United States is focusing on not just that, but what's going on in the Middle East and the potential growth of the conflict there. And again, what's happening in Southeast Asia and what could be going there. And I think rightly so, and I'm not a Trump fan, but I think rightly so, President Trump will push NATO and Europe to take on more responsibility if we expect the United States to move and to deal with the other burgeoning conflicts around the world. Share and share alike, I think, is the saying here. Joshua then goes on to say, as long as Ukraine can hold out for 4 years, they will survive. The West are working on a large package for Ukraine before Biden leaves. What support could Ukraine get before Trump arrives, and how long could they continue with reduced US support? There's a couple of good elements in there. What support could Ukraine get before Trump arrives? I think it's guaranteed supply of more ammunition, more air defense missiles, more fighting vehicles for the ground, and other capability there. The Ukrainians are saying the Bradley fighting vehicle, which is the US infantry fighting vehicle tracked with its Bushmaster cannon on it and its TOW missiles, is a game changer when it comes to conflict. Those that are operating it tend to love it, but they do need the artillery and funding for drones and bits and pieces. But I think the key bit would be the permissions to use Western long-range missiles against targets inside Russia. That is something that Ukraine has been asking for quite a while. That is something that military commentators such as I are saying it needs to happen, because the Russians at the moment are preparing their capabilities outside the range of current Ukrainian weapons and then using them to attack into Ukraine, and it's having a tactical military effect on what's going on. But I don't think when we get in, Trump is going to be as black and white and close things off as we think. So yes, Ukraine can hold out for another 4 years. How much territory they have to trade for that time, we don't know. The biggest shortage that there is in Ukraine and in Russia is manpower. The Ukrainians are not getting the sorts of replacements from call-ups that they were hoping for. The Russians clearly aren't doing that as well, because their Wagner group is heavily recruiting inside Africa, and we're seeing the deployment of North Korean troops to support Russia. So manpower, the ability to continue feeding the meat grinder from a Russian perspective, or defend against the meat grinder attacks from a Ukrainian perspective, is probably the biggest problem at the moment. And again, from Joshua, Putin won't reject the deal Trump will try to give him, and Trump will try to give him everything. What Trump doesn't understand is that Ukraine does not necessarily need our help to continue the war, and I see Trump as emboldening Putin and not restraining him. And he then asks, do we know that Putin would accept a peace or armistice deal from Trump? This is where it's really easy. And if we look at what Trump did in his first presidency, it's really easy to extrapolate that and get, I think, where he is in his current position wrong. There were some quite strong anti-Ukraine support comments that came out in between Trump's last presidency and this election, and when he gets sworn in. But a lot of those were down to issues with regard to US domestic politics. And if I take Mike Waltz, the new national security advisor in waiting, he initially voted for packages to support Ukraine. And then whenever it came to voting on the $60 billion support package that came in, he voted against it. And he made some quite strong comments against US support for Ukraine. But whenever you read into those comments, they were about the lack of a coherent plan from the Biden administration. It wasn't anti-Ukraine. It wasn't stopping Ukraine from defending itself. It was a dig at the Biden administration. And this was all in the lead up to the US presidential election. So I think now that the election's happened and we're moving on from that, we're going to see a sea change in what the international geopolitical stance is from the new regime as it comes in. And again, I think part of that's been set by Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, when he was doorstepped as people were debating his announcement and asked who he blamed for what is going on between Israel and Gaza. And he came out very clearly and said, 100% I blame Hamas. And we've seen statements out of Trump telling Hamas that if they haven't released the hostages by the time he is sworn in, then watch out. We're seeing these threats that are coming out. And then there was a phone call, allegedly, between Trump and Putin, or Trump's team and Putin's team, where allegedly Trump turned around and said to Putin, don't escalate in Ukraine anymore. Putin's team, through Peskov, their communications director, has denied that this phone call ever happened. But When we look at what happened then just after that, Russian national television posted naked pictures of Melania Trump, Donald Trump's wife, all over national television. And thinking of things from a former intelligence officer's perspective, that is Putin sending a message back to Trump. That's Putin threatening Trump. So what I see here is that phone call probably did happen in some way, but it didn't come in with the concessions that Putin was expecting, and Putin was concerned about it and therefore sent a message back to Donald Trump saying, hey, watch out, I'm going to play dirty, mate. We wait and see how this plays out, but we're living in interesting times. Greg McHale has said the importance is in the details of what Trump will force Ukraine to give up. And at this point, what might Trump expect Ukraine to compromise on? I've got a real difficulty with any compromise. And I don't think President Zelensky would want to compromise any territory. I think there are things that could come in that could be sold as a compromise, but it's difficult to see what the circumstances would be for them to come in. However, I think what Putin wants is the front line to be frozen as quickly as possible, and him to be given all of the territory that he has captured, and that is put into a peace line. Zelensky wants all of the territory back. So we're starting at two diametrically opposed positions and coming in. Neither side is going to be in a position to continue to fight forever, and all conflicts finish with some form of debate and diplomacy. I think Trump might turn around and say to Zelensky, if you allow Russia to keep Crimea and potentially a small element of the Donbass, then we will ask him to withdraw from all of the other areas and give security guarantees. Hey, Russian security guarantees from historical agreements haven't really worked. But I don't think Zelensky will agree to that. However, I think publicly Zelensky will turn around and say, I'm willing to negotiate, because he will expect Putin to go, I'm not giving anything up. And I think if we look at the arrogance of both leaders here, I think Putin is more arrogant than Zelensky is. Zelensky understands international statesmanship and will play an international statesmanship game, and Putin will refuse to give anything up. That will then force Donald Trump into a position where he's going to have to send a clear message to Vladimir Putin. And that message would be giving Zelensky the wherewithal to attack and hurt the Russians quite hard and quite fast. If we then come to a final solution, something that I could potentially see is a withdrawal back to the 2014 boundaries, where Crimea becomes an international protectorate and a demilitarized zone. And both countries have demilitarized zones on either side of their border where they agree, and there will be an agreement that Ukraine does not join NATO for 10 years, 15 years, or something that comes in. That could be something that could be sold to both sides. So there's no Russian ownership of Crimea, there's no Ukrainian ownership of Crimea. It becomes an international protectorate in the way that has happened historically before under United Nations auspices. But we're a long way off setting the conditions for that, and that is purely speculation by me. I haven't seen that written anywhere. Deborah asked the next question. There isn't a dictator he doesn't admire and want his ego to be petted by. Will Trump always side with authoritarians like Putin? I don't think Trump necessarily admires dictators for what they're doing as dictators and the horrific crimes most of them tend to commit. Trump thinks of things differently to most global leaders. He's not a politician, he's a businessman. And he's a businessman who is used to playing things dirty in the business world, as most successful businessmen are. And what he will want to do is keep his friends close, but keep his enemies closer, and get them in a position where he can look them in the eye and suss them out himself. And he's using that to make his business-driven decisions and what's going on. If this was an episode of Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, Sir Humphrey would be turning around to Trump and not just saying, that's a very brave move, Mr. President. he would be saying that's a very reckless move, Mr. President. And Sir Humphrey never used strong words like reckless. That's what the international community sees his relationship in the public domain with potential dictators and dictators around the world. And I think it worries people who come at things from a diplomacy and diplomatic background perspective. We have to look at the results. In his first presidency, Trump was played. Kim Jong-un played him and used that to gain more publicity for him than anything else. We just have to see how Trump has matured in the intervening 4 years and where he's going to go. Jeffrey Chin comes in with our final question and asks, why has Ukraine not pivoted right in Kursk and attacked through Russia's supply lines, pushing alongside their original border? Well, that's a very, very interesting and fantastic question, because if we look at what Ukraine has done, we've got everything going on in the east. We've got Ukrainians going into the Kursk. If they pivoted right, they could cut through the supply lines that are supplying Ukrainian activities in the east. There's two reasons for that. The first reason is quite simple. They don't have the sufficient capacity and capability to do that. If they did, they would leave their left flank open for the Russians to come in and attack into them. They'd spread themselves too thin, and they would then risk losing the toehold that they've got in the Kursk region. And the second thing is, they are doing that, but they're doing it in a different way. This is where General Budanov, who I think will come out as one of the heroes of this whole war, the head of Ukrainian intelligence, the GUR, is carrying out SOE-type operations in Russia's rear, attacking logistic lines of communication, the rail lines. We're seeing junction boxes catching fire. We're seeing factories catching fire. We're seeing oil refineries being attacked by drone. We're seeing airfields catching fire and being attacked by drone. All of this is what Budanov's doing. And this is effectively them trying to cut off the Russian supply lines, but using the special operations executive teams and agents that he's running inside Russia. And anecdotally, I've heard that, and Budanov as an ex-commando, he's gone and taken part in some of those raids himself. Very dangerous for someone at that level, but interesting, and it's something that we'll keep watching. Now, if you want your questions answered, please sign up for Times Radio Frontline membership, and that's at a link below, and then submit your questions. But many thanks for watching. See you next time.